Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General coming to you with some more Total War Warhammer lore, and today we are going to be looking at a probable legendary lord in Total War Warhammer 3, and that is Tzarina Katarin of Kislev, the mighty Ice Queen of the Northern Realm. Now, a quick caveat here, guys. If you've been watching my Kislev series, some of what you're about to see is taken from that video on the armies of Kislev. So bear in mind you can skip across certain sections if they seem familiar to you. But if you haven't seen that, don't worry and sit back and enjoy. So, the Tzarina, she was daughter to Tsar Boris the Red, one of the best Tsars that Kislev had ever had, really helped the country get back on its feet after the Great Chaos War, from which it took centuries to recover from, and he was a legend within his own right, but his daughter would go on to become almost a mythological figure within Kislev's society. When she was born, she was obviously the heir to the throne, and there was a time when she was only a toddler that her father disappeared for almost 19 days, and no one knew where he was. He kind of wandered into the woods to go and tame a bear with his bare hands. Now, having not returned after 18 days, people rightly probably assumed that he'd been killed by a bear, but he in fact survived, and so there was a lucky escape there to not have her have to sit on the throne of Kislev as a toddler alone. Her father returned from his religious endeavor of taming a bear with his Mount Erskine, the mighty white bear, and this would go on to become sort of a family pet of sorts, but still a kind of wild and dangerous creature. But young Lady Katarin never had any problems with Erskine the bear. Now, by all accounts, Boris the Red, or Boris Boka, as his family name was a fantastic father. She loved her father dearly, and she would often sit around late at night around the fireplace, listening to the tales her father and his chief lieutenants would tell in the royal palace, and they would be a boisterous and angry lot, but she would come to love them all dearly and fall in love through them with the nation and its history, all considered. She was able to grow up relatively normally as far as royalty is concerned in the Warhammer world, and just before reaching adolescence, she, like all the women within Kislev, was tested for the gift of ice magic. Now, she obviously had the gift of ice magic, which is not uncommon within the nobility of Kislev itself. In fact, the Ice Witches have formed almost a group or a coven within themselves, and they have worked very hard to make sure that ice magic is in the bloodlines of the Gospodar people of Kislev and the nobility of the Gospodar. Now, sometimes a commoner will emerge with the gift of ice magic, but it's sometimes hard for them to find a tutor. It's almost a Jedi system with the Ice Witches, where one is sort of taken under the wing of another Ice Witch to learn the ways it works. And if there's no one to take you under the wing, you tend not to really learn ice magic. Now, as far as learning the gifts of ice magic, it's not really discussed in the lore, at least as far as I'm aware, how Katarin went around learning it. Whether she had a mentor who taught her one-on-one, or because she was royalty, she had a multitude of teachers in the way of ice magic. But either way, she was taught it, and she rose up through the ranks of the Ice Witch Coven to become the most powerful Ice Witch in Kislev at the time. In the year 2517 of the Imperial calendar, Boris, Katarin's father, went to lead a small force of Kislev troops north after rumors of a Norscan raiding party heading south had reached the palace. Upon crossing into Troll country, they met a huge force of Chaos Raiders, much more than they had been prepared to face. Undaunted, Tsar Boris, on his trusty bear Erskine, led the charge into battle. Tainted Norscan warrior after warrior, they slashed down with weapon, claw, and tooth, one after the other, but after some time, the numbers just told, and Tsar Boris slowly found himself being completely surrounded. Onwards they fought, however, said to have fought that day with the fury of Urson the Bear God himself. They slew tens, if not hundreds, of enemy warriors before the Boris himself was mortally wounded, but that did not stop him. But again, wound after wound piled up as his blood dribbled down down onto the pure white fur of his bear Erskine. Barely able to maintain his place in the saddle, the bear decided to turn and take Boris back into the rear ranks of his army. Boris, mortally wounded several times over, refused to give way to death until he knew that the battle had been won by the forces of Kislev. Inspired by their leader, his troops went on to do that very thing, winning the day against the Norscan forces led by an evil Norscan warlord known as Hetzar Fadaj. Upon his death, his longtime companion and friend Erskine, his bear, his mount, his ally, is said to have roared for an entire night before disappearing into the northern wilderness, and said to be hunting those chaos filth that killed his friend to this very day. Now, it was said that many attempted to cajole Erskine back to Kislev, but he was having none of it. The bear's heart was filled with vengeance, and on he rode. Upon receiving the dire news, Katarin was devastated, but she knew her duty, and with a heavy heart, she rose and took up the throne. By now, the Tzarina had grown into a tall, majestic woman. She was said to be pale, with a majestically sculpted face, almost as though it was a work of art. Her eyes were said to resemble chips of cold sapphires, and she radiated ice magic wherever she went. If you were to touch her skin, your hands would burn. If you were to kiss her hand, your lips would burn, as though kissing a massive block of ice. Now, almost in an immediate show of her power and authority, she added an entirely new wing to the royal palace, raising it from the air itself, made completely of ice. It was huge and vastly outsized the other wings of the royal palace that existed. Now, some say she did this to kind of remain isolated, but others say it was just a display of power to daunt any foreign dignitaries who would come to visit her in this huge throne chamber made completely of ice, maintained by her own power. Now, although she was intimidating and had this immense power of magic, she was well beloved by all the people of Kislev. They loved her father, they loved her, there's no problem there. She's also said to be not a bad statesman either, being able to do a good deal of statescraft. She was never afraid to reward those who deserved it and punish those who offended her or the kingdom of Kislev. She would often turn up to state events armed with her legendary sword, Fearfrost, a particularly vexing attribute to the Empire, who long ago had lost much territory to the invading Gospodars and Mishka the Slaughterer, the first Tzarina, who wielded the blade Fearfrost. So not afraid to insult visiting diplomats if it puts them off guard and gets her what she wants for the betterment of Kislev itself. In terms of diplomatic strategy, she was always thinking kind of the long game and let's say a political tactician as well. Now, she has a deep pride and love for her nation. She always loved hearing the tales of the heroes of old Kislev. And this has led her to, at times, lead armies onto the battlefield, but not always. She's not always there. She sometimes stays in the throne room, as a queen would do. But she's such a powerful and beloved ice witch that people have actually said that she is Mishka, the first ice queen, the first person who was gifted ice magic of the Gospodar people, resurrected, otherwise known as Mishka the first Tzarina or Mishka the Slaughterer if you happen to be from the Ungol people who originally inhabited Kislev. So they think she's this ancient hero reborn, truly the mightiest of the ice witches in anyone's living memory, and a fantastic figure to potentially have in Total War Warhammer. Now, as many long-time viewers of my channel will know, I am not a huge fan of the end times, but Tzarina is missing quite a bit of lore. She used to have a bit more concerning the Storms of Chaos, which was an event that Games Workshop did that has since been removed from canon, but she does have quite a fun little telling of her eventual fate in the end times. That's almost a universal story. It's kind of self-contained, and for that reason, and because it doesn't involve long-term villains turning good, or good guys turning bad, or being imbued with a particular wind of magic or the other, or any of the usual kind of silliness that revolved around the end times. This is kind of a nice little tale, so for the first time in the channel's history, I'm going to include a bit of end time storytelling here as far as the eventual fate of the Tzarina Katarin. Katarin, the Tzarina of Kislev, finds herself in dire straits. The armies of chaos, led by Arkin the Ever-Chosen, the Lord of the End Times, has already rolled across Kislev. They have put town after town to the sword. Battle after battle has been lost in Kislev. The whole of the kingdom has been overrun. The final battle for Kislev has taken place, and the Kislevites lost. They were slaughtered. There's barely a fraction of the population left. The Tzarina herself was thrown by her horse and badly wounded during the final battle of Kislev's resistance, and she has been fleeing the forces of chaos ever since. Now she's gathered together some 1,000 of the final warriors of Kislev, as they've got any survivors they could from villages, from people who'd been hiding out, any survivors they could find on their travels, and they've gathered them together as a refugee train, and they've decided to try and head towards the coast to escape the hordes of chaos. A party sent out to find a healer for the Tzarina has just returned to camp, and they need her back on her feet if they stand any chance of escaping their ruined homeland. Eventually, they bring this healer into the Tzarina's tent, and the healer is distraught to find her Tzarina so hurt, and immediately starts to tend to her wounds. The Tzarina starts to feel a little bit better as the hours rolled on, and come evening time of that day, she decided to go out for a bit of a stroll with her usual bodyguards surrounding her. Now, she found herself at the entrance of a bit of a gully, and seeing an opportunity for a bit of isolation, just to sit and collect her thoughts of the horrors that had befallen her beloved Kislev, she erects an ice wall behind her, cutting off her bodyguard, and sits in the gully, observing the brilliance of the night sky above. Here, she sits and contemplates. So many people have died, and so many of them are yet to die. Her people were facing extermination. She knew they couldn't go into the Empire. The Empire had erected a bastion, a magical wall, and would not allow her people to enter for fear of infiltration or lack of resources. And she tried with all her might to hate the foul Karl Franz sitting in his imperial throne, but she knew it was a good leadership decision, and if the roles were swapped, she'd be doing exactly the same thing. Then the old adage entered her mind: Kislev is the land, and the land is Kislev. She was thinking back to the way her ancestors always fought as the land of Kislevs as a spiritual being. In fact, a spiritual being that granted her people the gift of ice magic and led them to these lands to look after and keep free from the blight of chaos. Chaos, however, was now rife over the entirety of the land, and everything, it seemed, had been lost. Its beautiful cities, once resplendent, were now corrupted, and nothing more but corpse-filled abattoirs. She thought back to sitting round the fireplace with her father, hearing the tales of the heroes of old Kislev, who would arise whenever the land had need of them. Where were those heroes now? Where were the gods? Where was the bear god Ursin and his salvation for her people? She and the people of Kislev had truly been forsaken. Then she thought to herself, why keep fighting? Why not just walk out into the darkness and meet your end by some unseen foe? Just have it all end here, for surely everything was lost. From behind her, a voice, sweet and innocent. Why are you out here all on your own? She spun round and drew her blade, for surely only a foe would be out at this time of night. But she saw only a young girl. How did you get in here? She could see behind the young girl her ice wall had not shirked or been broken down. How had this girl gotten into the gully? The girl simply shrugged, as though that was any kind of answer. You never answered my question. Why are you out here on your own? The Tzarina, confused and slightly enchanted by the girl's innocent naivete, simply said, "The quiet of darkness brings me comfort, child." Sensing that that was a bit of a silly answer, she was surprised to hear the girl replied with, "So do I. It removes all the sadness from the world. You can forget about it. The pain isn't there. It's as though it never happened." And the Tzarina looked at the child and thought, could it be that in this, her darkest moment, this child is the only one who understands her sentiment? But it did happen, child, and when the sun rises, it will all be evident again. Things will get even worse. I have failed in my duty to protect Kislev. The child looked up at her with fierce blue eyes and simply said, "You only fail if you don't try." The steely determination in her eyes captured the heart of the Tzarina. It reminded her of the hardiness of the people of Kislev, of their undying spirit, their unrelenting valor, and she took strength from this girl, finally asking her name. "Mishka," the girl replied, "like the first Tzarina, I've been told." Katarin simply let out a smile, thinking, of course, Mishka, the first Tzarina, reaching out in name alone to give me strength in the time of our direst need. The Tzarina took a deep breath, letting the frozen chill that lay at the heart of Kislev fill her lungs and spread through her flesh. She had had her strength of will renewed, and she looked down and said to Mishka, "We should get back." "Will they be mad that you ran off on your own?" she asked the Tzarina. "They will be, my dear, but they have love for me, and they shall forgive me." As she melted the wall of ice blocking the gully to allow her bodyguards to enter, she took Mishka's hand, and the two of them walked back to camp. The next morning, the 1,000 or so soldiers with their group of refugees started to pack up camp and began their ride towards Erengrad. Little Mishka, along with the healer, who's the one who'd initially found her and who Mishka had come to camp with, rode in the retinue of the Tzarina, because Mishka had been awarded the rank of an honorary half-maiden, so she was able to ride as a protector of the Ice Queen and as one of her closest confidants, for she had truly inspired the great ruler of Kislev. The Ice Queen herself had ridden a new horse that she got, for she'd lost her previous mount in the great battle against Chaos. And this horse, although not initially of white colour, had begun to get some grey speckles across its fur as it had been increasingly exposed to the Ice Queen's magic. For 5 days, they marched westwards, following rivers and the direction of the setting sun. They passed vista after vista of complete devastation. The land had been brutalized. Burned villages littered the landscape. Huge flocks of carrion birds would dim the light of the sun as they passed overhead. Wolves would openly eat the rotting carcasses of humans in the middle of town squares, where before they would have been reluctant to even enter the domain of man. The roads themselves were lined with the impaled corpses of Kislevite women, children, and soldiers. Flesh totems had been constructed out of the bodies, built into the shape of vast, black, rotting trees, where no tree belonged. Despite this, the party tried to keep its morale high. They had a scribe in the group from the Empire who went around grabbing as many of the stories of oral tradition from Kislev as he could, and keen were the soldiers to tell their own tales to this scribe so that they could be remembered. On the 6th day of the travel through the hellscape that had once been Kislev, they finally got a scent of the ocean. They made camp that night, knowing the next day they would come across Erengrad. The party knew that Erengrad had fallen several weeks before, but there was no other means of escape, and Erengrad was their best option. With the horrors they'd witnessed on the road, the Tzarina tried to steady herself for what she might witness the following day. And so as morning rose, they set off, and by the time the sun hit its pinnacle in midday of the following afternoon, they got to the gates of Erengrad. There seemed to be sentinels on the walls, but again, those were merely corpses of Kislev's soldiers, having been impaled with lances, ever to stand vigil over their desecrated homeland. There were, however, thousands of bodies of the Chaos Hordes that littered the ditch beneath the walls, and it could be seen that the soldiers of Kislev fought bravely, fighting off many times their numbers, although succumbing in the end. The eastern gates of Erengrad had been smashed open, and the Tzarina was first to enter the city. The horrors on the road could not have prepared her for the sights she would see within this devastated city. Flayed bodies littered the streets, with carrion birds fighting over scraps of skin that had been scattered about buildings. You could see where babies had had their heads bashed in against walls from the raiders, and there was a pile of dresses that one could only guess at the horrible fate that befell the Kislevite women of Erengrad. Men and boys had been hung on roof beams and used as archery practice. The horrors affected the Tzarina's party as well. She could hear the sobbing of the grown Kislevite warriors following in behind her, and she could hear several of them retch as they saw the horrors that awaited them within the city. They slowly began to search through the city for any survivors or anything that might be of aid to them as they made their way to the harbour of Erengrad. In the High City, they came across the Elven Quarter, where it was seen that it had been completely burnt to the ground, but the elves had conducted themselves well in the defence of the city. But they too had fallen, for these Norse savages cared not whether they were killing men or elves. They just wanted to kill. Within earshot of the Tzarina, the healer and Mishka the child could be heard. At the sight of a baby's bones in a cooking fire, the healer covered Mishka's eyes, said, "I don't want you to have to see any of this, Mishka." Mishka wrenched her hand away and simply said to the healer, "I don't want to, but I have to. Kislev is my country. I want to see what they've done to them." The Tzarina couldn't help but marvel at the old soul that inhabited this little girl. The child's strength was truly something to behold. However, even as strong as Mishka was, she could not hold back the tears as they streamed down her face. "They'll pay for this," she let out in a sobbing rage. The Tzarina turned to her. "They will, my child. Count on it," as they continued their march towards the harbour. The men had begun to discuss the madness of what had happened to Erengrad. What army in its right mind would burn and loot and leave a perfectly functional fort? From here, they could have set sail in ships across the whole of the Northern Empire without having to go through the wall that had been created. But these were not ordinary men. These were men who believed their gods needed them to slaughter and make war. With men like this, the Tzarina stated, they cannot be negotiated with. They are truly dangerous. "Then how do we fight them?" one of her knights asked them, and she simply replied, "With ice and sword." As they continued their way through the city, they noticed on the hill the temple to Tor, one of the Kislev gods, had gone relatively untouched, but the ice tower behind it, the Frost Home, had been devastated. It was slow going through the city, picking past the corpses and making sure there were no survivors for them to add to their caravan. They finally reached the harbour as the sun had begun to set. The harbour itself was pure chaos. Wrecked Norscan longboats that had rammed into the harbour had destroyed almost every single pier. And then the Tzarina caught the eye of one of her soldiers staring off into the distance. "What is it? What do you see?" And almost like a miracle, it came into her line of sight. There was a fully fitted and functioning Imperial merchant vessel sitting in the harbour of Erengrad, all alone. Could this truly be, or was her mind playing tricks on her? Her troops approached the vessel first, and a tense standoff occurred, where the Empire, not sure of the allegiance of these Kislevite soldiers, for stealing a uniform was not hard with so many bodies around. Eventually, the Tzarina got to the vessel, and the captain and all his crew bowed immediately before her. "What are you doing here?" the Tzarina asked with a tone of gratitude. I am here because of you, my lady. For 2 months straight I have dreamt only of you and you calling me to this place. The Tzarina was not aware of any effect she'd been consciously having on this man, but she was glad to see him, and he might have been the savior of them all. The sun had finally dropped below the horizon as the refugees began to load onto the merchant vessel. At that moment, there was a thunderclap, and the storm that had been following them ever since they left their initial encampment broke as rain thundered down on their position. Then, not long after, war horns could be heard sounding in the night. They were well known to the Kislevite troops by now. They were the sounds of the Chaos Horde. The Tzarina reacted immediately. Men of Kislev to arms, as she prepared herself to ride to buy some time for these refugees to escape. Loading on the boats, there was a struggle as Mishka escaped the grasp of the healer and ran to her new friend, the Tzarina of Kislev. The Tzarina knelt to talk to her small companion as the two embraced. What exactly was said between the two remains a mystery, but it's thought that Mishka begged the Tzarina to join them on the boat, and the Tzarina calmly explained to Mishka that there was no way she could. This was her home, and she was prepared to stay here, to defend it. Mishka and the Tzarina both wept into each other's arms. As the healer approached, the Tzarina handed off Mishka to the healer and made her promise to look after the child, as the two got on the boat. The soldiers of Kislev mounted up, and the Tzarina mounted her horse, which, at this point, had turned a brilliant white, and a sheen of frost followed its every hoofmark, as the ice magics of the Tzarina had infused with the animal. They rode back up the hill to the high city, up to the hill where the Temple of Tor had stood. This is where they would make their stand against the forces of chaos. The Queen and the forces of Kislev watched as a herd of chaos beastmen, so vast it managed to surround the entirety of the hill upon which they had placed themselves. Night had truly set now, and lightning began to streak across the sky, followed by bellowing thunder that seemed like the laughter of insane gods. Perhaps it is Tor himself who is protecting us, joked the Kislevites, as one of them took a swig from his flask. Katrina turned to him and said, I could probably do with a sip of that, as he handed it to her, and she took a big swig of the alcohol within. She passed the flask on to the rest of her troops, as they began to tell stories of their proud dead sons who had fought in the war just gone, and the daughters they hoped had escaped the carnage. But now they were proud Kislevite warriors on this hill with their queen. And that is when the Tzarina realized the love the men had. Not one had even thought about boarding the Empire ship, and she knew of no greater love in the world than this. And she began, You are my Bogaties, a kind of lieutenant in Kislevite speak, my faithful knights. And when men speak of this battle in the centuries to come, you will be its greatest heroes, Kislev's mightiest warriors, who will return when the land's need is greatest. Tears started to flow down the cheeks of her men out of the love and adoration they had for her in this moment. You all know I bore no heirs, but I have my sons and daughters here with me. The wind carried her booming voice down to the ship below, as the refugees could hear her making the speech. Whether through magic or fate, they could hear their great and noble queen very clearly. On this rain-soaked hill, we are all one people, one land. Today, we fight for Kislev. Today, we fight for her lost sons and daughters, for her proud mothers and fathers. Cheers started to erupt out of the Kislevite cavalry as they raised sword and lance to her speech. She let the cheers wash over her for a moment, thinking back to the old saying of ancient Tzarinas gone, Kislev is the land, and the land is Kislev. This was wrong. Kislev is the people, and the people are Kislev. the Tzarina thought to herself. Again, lightning struck out from around them as they saw ancient titans moving within the darkness of this massive chaos horde. These must be the Lords of Ruin themselves, here to see the fall of the Kislevites, the fall of the people who stood against their influence for centuries. At that moment, she felt an agonizing pain in her torso, as though her womb had been torn out. But as she took a gasp of Kislev air, ice magic filled her like it had never done before, and started to radiate out of her. Underneath the hooves of her horse, where once frost could form, a sheet of ice began to develop. Then the beastman filth in front of them let out a massive roar, and a single rider emerged from their number. He bore a banner of a clawed hand tearing at an icy crown. This was Fadaj, the Enorskan champion whose armies had slain her father, leading this horde of foul animals. Then, suddenly from behind them, a roar matched that of the beastmen and even raised louder than it. A single thunderous roar as the Kislevites turned around to see what kind of creature could have caused it. Down from the summit of the hill and out of the darkness, a huge lumbering shape moved towards them. And then, as it came into the light of their torches, they could see its pale fur. "I don't believe it," the Tzarina whispered out. The mighty bear Erskine, her father's companion and mount, a beast of enormous size and ferocity, had emerged to join the Kislevites on this charge. Had the bear been hunting her father's killers all this time through the wilds of Kislev? If so, it seemed fate had intertwined the two once more. Then, again, with a thunderous roar, Erskine, the mighty bear, began his charge down the hill, joined by Katarin, Tzarina of Kislev, and 1,000 lancers whose banners screeched as they tore down the hill towards the chaos horde. The Tzarina unleashed the new magical forces that were within her, and a mighty blizzard sprung up around them. The rain that had been falling began to turn to snow, and over the beastmen horde it turned to bladed hail, which started to cut up vast swathes of the animal filth. As the refugees sailed away, all they could see was a massive blizzard set itself around Eringrad, and there it remains, the fate of the battle unknown, as the mighty state of Kislev faded into history. And that was really it for Kislev and Tzarina in the end times. It's presumed she died in that battle, completely outnumbered by beastmen. We can hope she got revenge for her father, Tsar Boris, and Erskine managed to bite the intruder's head off for the sake of killing his master. But, you know, it was a nice send-off, and that's why I decided to include it in this video, guys. A kind of simple story as far as the end time stuff was concerned. So I hope you don't mind me including it, and I hope you enjoyed that telling. Now, in terms of her rules on the tabletop, she had a couple of mounts she could choose from. She could have a warhorse, which always turned white. It's almost like the Witcher with his horse Roach, where no matter what horse he has, he calls it Roach. The Tzarina, if she rides on any horse, her magic will radiate over the horse and cause it eventually to become white and leave ice trails in its hoof marks, making the horse itself magic if she has it for any amount of time. Now, she's also said to go around in an armored sled from time to time, almost bringing up that Lion Witch in the wardrobe kind of thing with that Ice Queen there. So the armored sled could be a potential second mount for her after the warhorse, and I think what you could do in Total War Warhammer in terms of her potential is give her a frost worm as well that they invented on the game for the Norskans, because that would fit very much the idea of her being able to ride an ice dragon, very fitting to the idea of the Ice Queen of Kislev. Now, in terms of her special rules, she had a special rule called Beloved by Kislev, the idea of embodying the love that people have for her, and this gave the Stubborn rule to units within 12 inches of her, basically a big moral buff to units around her, easily done in Total War Warhammer. We've seen that before. You could name it that. That'd be easily done. done. The next one is Protectors of the Ice Queen, and this is a rule that probably won't translate across. It'll probably translate as a buff for the Griffin Legion. It's the idea that there are restrictions on Griffin Legions you could bring in a Kislev army, the troops you could bring, and this kind of lifts that, but it'll just be a buff probably for the Griffin Legion if they do it at all. The next one is Fearfrost, her weapon itself. The blade that was forged by the first Tzarina, along with the help of Ulrich the Mad, the dwarf who had forged the rune fangs. So they work together on this blade that can only be wielded by women, or more specifically, ice witches, and it will kill any man who touches it. Now, the Fearfrost itself had Killing Blow, which is a rule we've discussed in some of my previous videos, and we've seen stuff like the Whites have in Total War Warhammer on the undead side of things. Now, the other one it had is there was no saving throw against this except for the ward, so it pierced any armor, so very high armor piercing this blade should have. Aside from the Fearfrost, her next magical item is the Crystal Cloak. Now, the Crystal Cloak is not a physical cloak she wears, it's more that she has this swirling mist of ice magic around her that gives her a save from incoming damage. On the tabletop it was 4+, so a 50% ward save. We're not going to see something that powerful, but she will probably get a ward save in Total War Warhammer, and it gave a debuff to hitting her. So maybe a debuff to melee attack, and maybe a debuff to weapon strength as well, if you're getting near the Ice Queen. Now, that's about it for her special rules. She, of course, also had access to ice magic, which we will inevitably see introduced with Kislev army if it makes it into Total War Warhammer. So let's go through some of the spells and how they might translate into Total War Warhammer. So the first spell of ice magic is relatively simple. We'll probably see it make an iteration, and that is Shard Storm. Now, this is just her shooting shards of ice at the enemies. It's a magic missile attack. We've seen those before in Total War Warhammer. Fairly easy for the boys at Creative Assembly to implement. They could probably take some of the effects they already have, color them blue, boom, you've got Ice Shard. Easily done. The next one, however, is a little bit more tricky. Freezing Blast. Now, what this one did was, the idea is kind of very interesting, is that it throws water terrain. So if you were doing a river battle, you could freeze the river, and like the Chaos Army did to Kislev in the Great War, your army would be able to walk across the ice and attack around the sides. Now, we have had the reintroduction of river battles and the like in Total War Warhammer, so it would be great to see them implement this rule, but I will admit it's a bit more of a technical thing to do in terms of AI pathing and stuff like that, and for that reason, we probably won't see it. I'm sad to say, the cynic in me is like, we probably won't see this one directly translated. It might be turned into an explosion spell like Awakening of the Wood, something along those lines. But it'd be great to see an actual spell have a transformative effect on a map. Now, obviously, it would only be able to be used in specific situations, but if it were, it would be great to see, particularly from a campaign point of view. The next one is Form of the Frost Fiend. Now, this is where the caster turns into a massive ice creature with huge talons that attacks the enemy. Now, in Total War Warhammer, I don't think we'll see the actual wizard change into this creature. I think what it's more likely to be is a summoning spell where you summon these Frost Fiends. Maybe something of the size of Treekin, probably. That's just my theory on that, if they're going to make it a thing that you can summon. The next one is Invocation of the Ice Storm. Now, this is an area of effect spell. You could make this a vortex spell if you wanted to. It slows down the enemy and it does damage to them, as one might guess. Just an ice storm twirling around the map. I think we've seen similar stuff before. It wouldn't be that hard for them to implement. The next one is Midwinter's Kiss. Now, this is a breath attack. Again, something we've seen in the game so far. Add an ice effect to it. We've got it. It's done. The mechanics are already in the game. Easy enough to implement. The next one and last one is actually another trickier one. So we had Freezing Blast, which was the terrain. The next one is Glacial Barrier, where you erect a wall of ice. Now, this again would be terrain changing, and that's why I think we probably won't see it, although it would be very cool to see. If you could actually build a physical barrier the enemies either have to destroy or get through. They have had similar mechanics in terms of barricades and stuff before in the Total War series, But we haven't seen it in Total War Warhammer so far, and that would be a very interesting thing to see. If you could just protect one of your flanks with a massive wall of ice, or pin the enemy in with a massive wall of ice, that would be a really fascinating and powerful spell for the game, and make Kislev a very interesting faction to play. But as I said, take a bit more work. Thus, my skepticism kicks in, and we probably might not get it in its original form. It might just be, again, another slowing spell of some kind where you see an effect on the ground and enemies who walk over it are slowed down. Something like that. That would be a bit sadder, but I'd love to see walls of ice erupting out of the ground or forming out of the air and blocking off enemy pathways. That'd be a fantastic addition to the game, in my opinion. And that's about it for the ice magic and Tzarina. Truly a powerful witch, one of the most powerful magic users, although only of a single law within human society. Really a fantastic character, and I can't wait to see her in Total War Warhammer 3. But as always, guys, a huge thank you all for watching. Do check out some of my other Legendary Lord lore videos popping up now. But other than that, as I said, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all on the next one. Alright guys, thanks, bye.